So again, good afternoon. Thanks for attending this talk. So I am Samik Bhattacharya. I'm an assistant professor at the MA department at UCF. And I'm going to talk today about the fluid dynamics of natural flyers and swimmers, which is the major focus of my current research. So in particular, I'm going to focus on two problems. The first one is related to the hydrodynamics of morphing pectoral fins, which is related to the underwater swimming. And then the next one will be a problem on avian aerodynamics, which will be effect of ground on perching maneuver. Now, I am an experimentalist. So what I do in my lab at experimental fluid mechanics lab at UCF, that I use advanced diagnostics technique to measure the forces and the flow field of these problems. So the broad objective of my research, whether it's in flying or swimming, that to to understand these different type of vortices that form on a flapping wing or on a flapping fins, and because this flight takes place at a very low speed compared to our regular commercial flights. These are called the low Reynolds number flow, and in low Reynolds number flow, the aerodynamics is entirely different, and it's governed by unsteady phenomena such as this leading edge vortex or the trailing edge vortex or the tip vortex. So the major goal of my research is to understand the fluid mechanics, so the flow field and the forces. So majorly, I try to understand the unsteady forces and the flow field of the vortex dynamics, and then I also develop mathematical models. So this is kind of a triad diagram of which encompasses my research. Now, one of the important point is that we are not biologists. Since we are engineers, we are not certified to use real bird wing or a real fish fin. So we apply something called a principle of abstraction, where we replace the wing with simple planforms. And the idea here is that we want to retain the major physics of the flow, and by kind of removing all the other complicated auxiliary features. So the first problem I'm going to talk is related to swimming. So this project started with a funding from Office of Naval Research, and then I'm continuing this with my current NSF career grant. So here our focus is to study the transient fluid structure interaction of bio-inspired morphing fins. The motivation, of course, comes from nature. So if you look at nature, whether it's the dolphins, dorsal and pectoral fin, or the flukes of whale or the manta rays pectoral fin, none of them are rigid wings, as we see in our commercial aircrafts. Even birds, they do have morphing fins. So what we try to understand that how they control the flow with different type of span-wise bending and twisting. So I already explained you the principle of abstraction. So what we do, we mimic those wings with 3D printed flat plates, and which have got some internal grooves or the cavity, where we insert some steel rods, and they are connected to a servo motor, and when the servo rotates, they perform this morphing mechanism. So in the next slide, you can see this 3D printed plate performing a span-wise bending. Again, the idea here is that we are not exactly using a pectoral fin of a manta ray or a whale, but what we are trying to do, we are extracting a very rudimentary span-wise morphing, which is a bending in this case, and then we are trying to understand what are the implications in terms of forces and flow fields. The next is a twisting maneuver. When we rotate one servo ahead of other, we can get this twisting maneuver. So with these two rudimentary morphing capabilities, we put this wing in our fish towing tank, which is a giant fish tank, 6 meter long and 1 meter by 1 meter cross section. This is equipped with multiple motors to create different type of kinematics. The pitching creates, it can pitches the wing about the axis. The plunging, as you can see here, it creates sidewise motion. And then in terms of, we use force sensors, 6 degree of freedom force sensors to measure the lift and drag on this type of wings. And to perform the flow field measurement, we mix seeding particles in the flow and then shine lasers so that they scatter light. And then, as you will see in this left side video, we use a high-speed camera to capture the motion of these particles. So this experiment is known as particle image velocimetry experiment. And then we can analyze these videos, post-process them to get the different flow structure. So here is a PIV experiment in our lab. As you can see, we move both the laser and the camera with the wing, and we are able to measure at different span-wise locations. So we are able to measure all along the around the morphing wing, and we have already done that and published it in Journal of Fluid Mechanics. As you can see here, I'm not going into the details of this figure, but clearly qualitatively you can see these different vortices. So the top, the left column, the leftmost column is a rigid wing as denoted by this rectangle. So we measure the leading edge vortex or the edge vortex at different span-wise location, which is the A and D of figure. And then we also measured the tip vortex, which is G, figure number G, at the tip of the wing. And you can clearly see that when the wing bends away from the flow, the tip vortex and the leading edge vortex, their structure is entirely different from the rigid wing. So we are able to explain the vortex dynamics that occurs due to this different type of morphings. And here is another example. So this is a rigid wing at 70% span, and then this one is performing a twisting maneuver. And the idea here is you can clearly see that when it twists away from the flow, the vortex remains attached. So you get a lift benefit for longer amount of time. But when it twists into the flow, you cause the vortex to grow bigger and shed earlier than in a rigid case. So the idea here is, for a very simple rudimentary, this type of a twisting or bending maneuver, the flow field get immensely are immensely different from a rigid case. So we also measured the forces with instantaneous force sensor, and we showed that with this type of morphing, your lift coefficient gets augmented during the unsteady part of the maneuver. So in next few minutes, I'm going to discuss the second problem, which is related to flying. And in this problem, what we are focusing on is something called a perching maneuvers. So this perching, as you can see in this right video, that a bird is trying to land, and when the small bird is trying to land, it is performing a unsteady maneuver, a post-stall maneuver, which is known as perching. So what it does, it rotates its body at a high angle of attack so that the wing goes more than 90 degrees. Now this is an unsteady maneuver. Any engineering aircraft, if it tries to perform the maneuver, it will go into the stall regime and it will just crash. But nature is able to control the flow, and the way it does due to the perching maneuver, what happens, a leading edge vortex forms, and that gives the lift capability, lift augmentation. So what we are interested to see in this problem, that what happens when, or since most of the landing happens close to ground, whether the birds are able to use the ground effect. So we look into the ground effect, and we also, some other question, fundamental question we are asking is, what is the importance of the phase lag between the deceleration and the pitch up maneuver? That how does the bird decide when to start the pitch up maneuver? So again, we apply the principle of abstraction. So we are not working with real bird wings. Rather, we use a outward swept plate as shown in the figure B here to mimic bird's wing. And then we create a kinematics, as you can see in the figure A here, that the airfoil follows a downward inclined trajectory, and at the same time it pitches up. So that's how we simulate the perching maneuver in our experimental facility, and due to this, the effective angle of attack and the velocity all changes. So again, very similar type of experiment. We perform experiment in water. Now the reason is that water gives us the ability to get very high quality optical flow field data. And if we are able to match the Reynolds number and the reduced frequency, then we can get similar results as in air. So here also very similar type of experiment. We measure the forces and we perform PIV, and we are doing these experiments at different height from the ground, and the ground here is denoted by the sidewall. So here is the animation that how we do it. So the main traverse move the wing forward, and then the plunging motor moves the wing sidewise, and then the forward and the sidewise movement effectively creates a uh, trajectory in a which mimics the perching maneuver. So we have already published this data in Physical Review of Fluids, and it got a lot of attention. It was selected as editor suggestion, featured in their physics magazine. So we showed here that the swept platform actually augments the lift forces during this type of perching, and that is due to a very stable leading edge vortex. Next, we have also measured the instantaneous forces, and we have showed that it is not only like the perching maneuver. What is also important is the ground height. So at very low ground height, you can get a higher CL as shown in this figure for these different shape change numbers. So I will quickly go through. So we also perform particle image velocity experiment. Since I am out of time, I will conclude here, but with a good news that we recently received a funding from AFOSR, where we are going to look into gust interaction with morphing wings. And the gust interaction is basically when you have a sudden disturbance and a wing is going over it. So we have started working on that, and we are doing preliminary work developing a gas generator in our towing tank. So with that, I would like to conclude, and I would like to acknowledge the funding agencies and a number of graduate and undergraduate students who worked in our lab and made all this possible. With this, I conclude my experiment presentation, and would welcome any questions if you have.